Hi, I'm Damian Perry. I'm the president of the Arlington Independent Media Board. This is the third of 5 candidate forums. We'll be speaking with 2 candidates for Commonwealth's Attorney. Our panel for this discussion is Hannah Dannon-Feltzer, community volunteer, Wilma Jones, a community activist and civic leader, and Christian Dorsey, the chair of the Arlington County Board. In this episode, our panelists will be speaking with Parissa Dehghani-Tafti, the incumbent for Commonwealth's Attorney.
We're going to start off today, Parissa, talking about motivation. What motivated you to run for Commonwealth's Attorney and now to run for re-election?
So I am a natural problem solver, and I went to law school because a friend of mine was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And I worked on death penalty cases. I worked as a public defender. I worked as an innocence attorney. Everything I've done in my career has always, like the through line has always been to solve a problem. And when I was looking at my own jurisdiction, knowing the power of a prosecutor, having been on the other side for 20 years, and I realized that there were significant things wrong in our system. You know, for example, we were asking for cash bail, and when our delegation suggested maybe not asking for cash bail, the Commonwealth Attorney at the time said that they were being silly. We were stacking charges, and people were being coerced to plead guilty to lesser charges, and it was the system of discovery, which is the process by which defense attorneys receive information about a case, because Virginia doesn't have a right for defense attorneys to even see police reports. The system of discovery required defense attorneys to go into the CA's office, which means you can only go during business hours, which is also when court is going on, but to go into the CA's office and sit in a room in the CA's office and review files and take notes from those files. That I thought I saw things like that. I saw the fact that our black population is 9%, but our population that was being charged with simple marijuana possession, just as one example, was 57% black, and that those things weren't being addressed, that racial disparities weren't being addressed, due process wasn't being addressed, and you know, it was just, Arlington was very much behind the times and behind the evidence of what works in the criminal legal system. So I decided, I was actually looking for somebody else to run, to be honest with you. I was like hearing the problems, examining the problems, and at the time I was the legal director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, so I had a fantastic job. But ultimately, there was a moment when I realized that it had to be me because of my background, and that it had to be me because of the skill set and vision that I bring to this.
So there are a lot of conversations in the community about crime. Is it increasing? Are these concerning, or are these temporary blips? What are some of the root causes? Can you just give us some of your perspectives about crime in Arlington?
So I want to start with crime data is very hard to understand, because even the ACPD has 3 sets of data. There's the set that gets published on the county portal. There's a set that gets published with their annual report, and then there's a set that gets published to the state. So there's a lot of different conflicting information depending on where you look. But if you look at 2020 to 2022, 2020 looks unnaturally low because we were in a pandemic. If you look at 2010 to 2022, what you see is, you know, up and down. There's a spike in 2016. I'm not really sure what that was, but there's a big spike in 2016, and then it goes up and down. So it's cyclical, and it's still within the realm of normal, what we have. But we've gone through a massive upheaval, both in terms of the pandemic, in terms of economic insecurity becoming more pronounced, and in terms of people being traumatized by everything that's happened socially and politically and medically over the last 3 years. So, we're in an unprecedented time economically where the less have even less than they had a few years ago, and that's one of the drivers of crime is poverty. Another driver of crime is also lack of mental health support, and so we're also in a time where we are extremely traumatized, and we have a higher rate of mental illness than we've ever had before, and we have great things on the horizon in Arlington. The CIC just opened at DHS. We are getting the hospital beds, the mental health hospital beds. We have great things coming, but we don't have those in place, and we haven't had those in place for the last few years. So my answer is it is cyclical. We can get to the root causes because they tend to be mental health, poverty, lack of education, lack of job opportunities. If we can provide those supports for people, then we will end up with a safer community in the end.
Can you talk to us about how you'd characterize the relationship between your office and the Arlington County Police Department? And are there any changes that you'd like to see there in that relationship?
After I won the primary in 2019, I sat down with the chief, and I made myself available in 3 very large fora where with the 50 to 70 police officers came, and I stood in front of them and I answered their questions, and I answered their questions in the same way that I had been answering questions before, but and so I was telling them where I was coming from. I was giving them an opportunity to challenge me. I was giving them an opportunity to start lines of communication. And I think I had a great relationship with Chief Farr. And when there was a time where he retired a couple of months early, and the rumor mill was saying that he'd retired early because of me, he actually, of his own volition, wrote an opinion piece in Arl Now that said that he actually, even though he looked at things through a different lens, that he found that I was always available and always willing to listen to his perspective. And I did ride-alongs. I, went to the academy. I learned how to shoot a gun. I have made significant efforts to build bridges and to make sure that there are lines of communication open. I'm sure you're asking that because there was a recent endorsement of my opponent by the police union. I think that the CA's office needs to have an independent relationship from the police. We play an oversight role in a big way. When we have to look at use of force to see if it's a crime, or when we have to prosecute some other thing that may be a crime. But on a daily basis, we vouch for police officers when we put them on the stand. We look at every case to see, is there probable cause? We are constantly, in everything we do, making judgments about police work. And we need to have a respectful and open relationship with the police, but it needs to be a very independent relationship with the police. It can't be such that we're not questioning enough, and it can't be such that we're not taking a critical eye towards things.
So now let's talk about some programs and things that help the people who are being prosecuted or who are being convicted to have diversion. So talk about your insight into the diversion programs that are currently in place to avoid prosecution or to avoid a criminal conviction for the offenders.
So Arlington had only drug court for adults when I came into office. And when I came into office, there were only 4 people in drug court. I'm proud to say that we've quadrupled the number of people, which means that more people are getting treatment. And our drug court is effective. The people who graduate I mean, they have jobs, they have housing, they are stable, you know, they've been sober for usually by that time of year. But I also helped create a behavioral health docket, which is essentially a mental health docket. And that's also been extremely successful. DHS provides wraparound services that include housing help, that include medication and therapy, that include recreational or occupational therapy, as well as peer support. And we've seen again with the people that have graduated from the behavioral health docket, extreme success to the point where DHS now wants to double its size. But I also worked with OAR, which is the Offender Aid and Rehabilitation, to create something similar, or not mental health or drug court, but something similar in the sense that their diversion program provides peer support, it provides job training or GED education as part of its community service, and it also provides cognitive behavioral therapy as well as other needs, and it's targeted towards what the person needs. And so the folks that are, we hope are going into that program have been people who are charged of something fairly serious, but it's their first time involved in the system, or people who have done a number of, have had sort of a series of misdemeanors. And it's clear that what we've been doing isn't working, so it's time to try something different. And I think the most important diversion program that I think that we've created, and what is, for me, I don't want to say my baby, but what is to me like the most significant and transformative program is the Restorative Justice Program, and the partnership that we have with Restorative Arlington, because it centers the voices of victims. The very first criteria that we have for any restorative justice process is that the person harmed, the victim, is on board and wants to engage. And then, and when we see restorative practices and restorative justice employed in the legal system, we see higher rates of satisfaction, higher rates of healing, less re-traumatization for victims. And then we also see on the side of the offender that there's reduced recidivism, because they have to tell the truth about what happened. They have to explain why. They have to do sorry. And that is actually transformative. So you see some programs even that have 0% recidivism rates, but quite often it's like 20, 30, 40%.
So with those programs and with, the oversight responsibility that you described for the police department, as well as your vision for the office, requires resources. In addition to you, there are of course other prosecutors, professional staff that work with victims as well as witnesses and other support professionals. How do you view the resources necessary to deliver on your vision? Are you sufficiently resourced? If not, what do you need in order to get to where you want to go?
So we're right now in a stage where it's really hard to find prosecutors. Reuters wrote an article last year about the challenge that every prosecutor's office across the nation, whether it's urban, reform, rural, suburban, law and order, all of these kinds of offices were having challenges retaining and hiring attorneys. In that context, what I've done is frozen some attorney positions and turned those into administrative support positions, because things like body worn have radically changed. I mean, body worn came online in December of 2020, and it has radically changed the way that we practice law, just overnight. And there's just a tremendous amount of additional administrative work that is involved. So we're shifting some of the work to administrators, but we also have, for example, hired somebody with a social work background that is funded by the BJA right now, a grant, but is eventually I'm going to be asking to be funded by the county. But this person is in the bonds docket on an almost daily basis. And what they're doing, because with their social work background, is finding the cases that should go to bond diversion as quickly as possible, finding the cases that should go to other kinds of diversion as quickly as possible, and identifying, because 60% of our court-involved population is not from Arlington, identifying in our surrounding jurisdictions the diversion programs that work and building relationships with them so that we are not in a silo in Arlington, and so that we're treating everybody fairly. So I've rethought the way in doing that, in doing these things, the way that a prosecutor's office works. And I'm proud that the Department of Justice agrees that this is, it was a smart prosecution grant. And so, they agree that this is an innovative thing to do. But, I would love to have an investigator in the office. We often have victims and witnesses who don't want marked cars and uniformed officers showing up to serve subpoenas. It exposes people to risk. It exposes people to some embarrassment. And having somebody from our office being able to do something to perform those tasks and to form other sort of follow-up investigative tasks, like finding certain witnesses, would not only help the police department but also help us, and it would also help us direct some of the work that we do towards better protecting vulnerable populations. Like, one of my priorities has been wage theft, but I need an investigator in the office that I can direct to work with the Department of Labor, which is ready, willing to work with me on these cases.
And Parissa, we're talking a little bit about the roles within the office, and part of the discussion in this campaign has been around criminal trial experience, and in particular in your role within that. Can you speak a little bit towards your background and how you view your role in terms of the criminal trial experience?
Well, we had this discussion thoroughly in 2019. I mean, my first case that I ever worked on, my first client was, it wasn't my first, my first client was we had a murder trial in Louisiana. I've represented hundreds of people in all kinds of hearings, and I've learned in the innocence work that we've done how to build a case, and I think that's an important skill, that what elements you need to prove. And oftentimes with our innocence clients, we were actually doing what Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels, because 20 years after the fact, we're trying to prove that a client is innocent, and we have to oftentimes also prove that somebody else is guilty. And it's a very high standard of proof. So I think that experience is important, and I think being able to transform the office, being able to think in terms of, why don't we get a social worker so that we can communicate with our surrounding jurisdictions? Why don't we get an investigator so that we can protect vulnerable communities? Why don't we get a conviction review attorney so that we can go back and look at past convictions to make sure that they were accurate? That there's no shortage of post-conviction work out there that needs to be had. I think having those experiences is actually what has made me able to transform the office and make it's something that is a national model for what offices can look like. You can't be yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we're going to shift a little bit here. Let's talk about our youth. There are in this last school year, there's been a lot of focus on some of the things that have happened in the schools. So there's, of course, an increase in the amount of illicit drugs and more kids bringing guns to schools. How do you plan on dealing with juvenile offenders?
So I do believe that we should treat kids like kids, but I also think that we need to take this serious crime seriously. And what we've seen with kids is not different than what we've seen with adults, which is a tremendous amount of mental health trauma. And we have not provided kids the supports they need to work through that trauma, which is why people start using, right? Like the lack of connection, the lack of buy-in, the lack of feeling like a part of a community is usually what causes people to start using. So we need to triage the problem, which I think we've been doing. We need to provide better treatment for kids, and we need to move upstream to make sure that we are providing the supports so that the demand for things like drugs is not there. But I'd also think that we shouldn't overreact by trying to lock kids up who are using, and instead make sure that they get treatment. What we're doing in terms of gun, we're taking the gun crime seriously. We've only had, I think, one situation where somebody went to school with a gun, and we're taking that extremely seriously. But we also need to do preventative work there. And we need to acknowledge that we are a country that is drowning in guns. And some of the preventative work that I've been doing is, I've partnered with APS, ACPD, and the court services. So it's schools, police, and court services, which is the juvenile intake. We've partnered together and are creating with an organization a juvenile justice Jeopardy game that teaches kids what the rules are, both in school and the law, that teaches kids what rights they have, that teaches kids how to behave so that interactions with police don't escalate. And we just had sort of the test runs on the game last week, and the kids were wild about it. They were learning in an excited and experiential way that really provides sort of deep understanding of what of the issues that they're dealing with. And so, and that emerged out of ACPD coming to my office and saying, look, kids are bringing BB guns that look like real guns to school. This is a problem. So the immediate solve was, let's make sure we have like an education program, tell the schools to report. And then the longer term solution was this juvenile justice Jeopardy game. But I'm also working with Moms Demand Action to try to create a gun buyback program to coordinate our lobbying efforts on guns, and to bring violence interrupters, or at least violence interruption training to Arlington.
So I'd like to return to the very beginning when you cited disproportionality data as it related to Black Americans and arrests in Arlington. And if we can agree that that's true not only for arrests, but also for convictions and incarcerations, commonly people describe this as systemic racism.
Right.
And I'd love for you to unpack what your role is in dismantling systemic racism. What can you do in your role and capacity to change some of the reasons why you felt running was necessary in the first place?
So we are really the end of the process, and so we're the tail of the dog, right? And there's no question that what we can do is limited. But there are a few things we can do. The first thing is, in 2020, I asked independent researchers to look at the charging and conviction data from 2017 and 2018. They got a BJA grant. It took them months to do it, but the report indicates that Black people were charged at a 50% higher rate of seriousness than white people, even when you controlled for all of the factors. And if you were Black or Hispanic, you were more likely to be convicted, you were more likely to be sentenced to incarceration, and you were more likely to have a longer period of probation than if you were white or Asian. Those are significant problems. We've had those same researchers come back to check our work, which is in process right now, to see if the policies that we've adopted have helped. And some of those policies are not asking for cash bail, because you don't want to criminalize poverty. You also don't want people who are dangerous being able to get out because they can afford to, right? But so that's one of the policies. Mandatory minimums are key drivers of mass incarceration, and the kinds of things that have mandatory minimums often end up being affecting disproportionately communities of color. So working not just in the office, to try to charge with accuracy, but not something that has a mandatory minimum when possible, is important. But also, and having the conversations in the office is important, because if we're just blindly, without looking at race, without paying attention to the fact that the system has racism built into it, if we're just blindly, or color blindly, processing cases and go resolving these cases, what we are doing is replicating the same problems. And in the diversion programs that we've created, we are very conscious to make sure that we don't end up doing what the first progressive era did, which is understand that that crime is driven by socioeconomic factors, but only for European people, right?
And Parissa, we're going to just, as we get to the end of our time here, we just want to make, all right, it's great conversation. We just wanted to make sure we get a final question in to you about shifting a little bit to talk about your campaign and the campaign strategy specifically. You had a mailer recently that you were highlighting the Republican donors for your opponent, and wanted to ask you a little about what was the motivation for your campaign, bringing that out and putting that into your mailers?
Well, it's about trust. And, can you trust what somebody says? Because the Republican fundraisers that were happening, were sort of, in huge red font that, crime is rising and, there's blood running in the streets of Arlington. Very much right-wing talking points. And when money comes from, money doesn't just fall on your laps when you're a candidate. You have call time. My opponent has a fundraiser that he's paid over $20,000 to. So, you're sitting down and you're calling people and soliciting money. If you're soliciting money from somebody who has given Glenn Youngkin, who is very anti-reform, if you're soliciting money from them or accepting money from them, if you're going to the homes of people who have supported anti-reform, then what are you telling them? You're not telling them that you're treating kids like kids. And because these are not sort of pro-reform people. And I know from people who've gone to these that is in fact not what my opponent has been saying. And so it's really a question of, is he really a reformer? Then the answer is no. And I think the fact that he is so much funded by folks who've funded anti-reform that it can't be trusted.
Well, thank you very much, Parissa. We appreciate your having this conversation with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.